Hello, everyone. My name is Douglas Jorf. I am a Citrus County High School vocational teacher. I will be facilitating a short lesson today on behavioral and social learning as researched by Ivan Pavlov. Now, some learning objectives today is to describe how Pavlov's early work in classical conditioning influenced the understanding of learning. And even if it's still used in today's schools, that's a good idea to keep in mind for later discussion. And also to review the concepts of behavior psychology and social learning, as well as classical conditioning, which was the main idea that Pavlov circled his research around. So while getting into some of these topics, we want to make sure that we have a great understanding of the learning objectives and the topics that we will be discussing, being both behavioral, classical conditioning, and these things that I will bring up again just so I refresh them in everybody's mind and try to learn something a little bit new, maybe a new aspect of these topics. Now, we want to take a moment to go into some key concepts to consider with behavior psychology. This way we set up a bit of a foundation and understanding before we move forward into the concepts of social learning theory. So first, let's touch on the key concepts of behavior psychology. And these concepts, of course, will help build us up before we reach the final point. So, one of the first key concepts, behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology, is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning, some sort of conditioning that we are involved in. So again, behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology, is the theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through some sort of conditioning that we go through in our environment. Also, behaviorists believe that our responses, whatever our responses are, to the environmental stimuli shape our actions. So every action that we do in our day-to-day lives, behaviorists believe that they are our responses to the environmental stimuli. And these shape all of our actions. All right? Those are two of the main ideas. Third idea, conditioning occurs through interaction with your environment. Any type of conditioning that you have is brought up through any type of interaction with the environment. And any type of interaction with your environment, of course, can be with person to person, and that can be an adult, a child, whoever, a stranger on the street, or just your environment altogether. Where were you brought up? What were your surroundings? That nature-nurture type of idea. Okay, so now moving from those key concepts into social learning theory, keeping those ideas in mind, and we're going to kind of join these two things together. And then we're going to move towards classical conditioning a little bit later. But we're going to start going into some of the key concepts to consider while discussing social learning theory. We understand so far that behavior psychology are acquired through some sort of conditioning. So now how does social aspects come into play? All right, so first, a theory of learning and social behavior, which proposes that new behaviors can be acquired by observing and imitating others. So again, this is a theory of learning and social behavior, which proposes that new behaviors can be acquired by observing and imitating others. And also, anytime we have somebody that we're inspired by, anytime that we're maybe seeing something on a movie or a show that we're inspired by, we imitate those behaviors, maybe even subconsciously. Second, it states that learning is a cognitive process that takes place in a social context and can occur purely through observation or direct instruction. You can be taught it, or you can pick it up, maybe subconsciously, just through observation. So that's what it states. This type of learning is a cognitive process. It takes place in a social context and can occur purely through observation or direct instruction. Thirdly, in addition to the observation of behaviors in your environment, learning also occurs through the observation of rewards and punishments. Now, as far as in Ivan Pavlov, his idea through classical conditioning was that rewards and punishments to incite some sort of response. So again, in addition to the observation of behaviors, learning also occurs through the observation of rewards. Of rewards. So Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov's approach. Okay, what was his approach specifically? Right, he's a psychologist. He was studying behaviors through animals, right, mainly dogs. So what was his approach specifically? He wanted to study classical conditioning, or he termed it classical conditioning, going back with behavior psychology as well as social. Right, so his approach was bring in the dogs. And I'm fairly sure at this moment, all the lab rats in the world rejoiced. He wanted to study dogs and use his behavior theory on them mainly, stemming towards classical conditioning. So what was his approach and how did he use the dogs? So we can go into his main idea of classical conditioning, made famous by Ivan Pavlov's experiments with the dogs, and operant conditioning. Again, his idea mainly classical conditioning, made famous by himself, with the dogs, and operant conditioning. Anytime everybody says you ring a bell and a dog begins to salivate, they're speaking of Pavlov, and this is his idea of classical conditioning lending itself to the overall theme of behaviorism. Okay. Third, classical conditioning set the groundwork for present-day behavior modification practices. So what we learned through the dogs that helped us to understand our own process with behavioral ideas, social ideas, interaction with our environment, what they taught us was this idea of classical conditioning. It set the groundwork. His studies and his practices with the dogs set the groundwork for our present-day behaviors. All right. So what was so special about Pavlov's dogs? Right? What was going on in the experiments that he was going back and forth with the dog on? Right? Was it just that they came into his presence doing the types of things that they did, or were they trained in a sort of way? What was the response triggered by? So what was so special about his dogs? All right. Now, in the early 20th century, Pavlov did Nobel Prize-winning work on digestion. Mainly, this was his study. While studying the role of saliva in dogs' digestive processes, he stumbled upon a phenomenon he labeled psychic reflexes, an accidental discovery that he had the foresight to see the importance of. Pavlov's dogs, restrained in an experimental chamber, were presented with meat powder, and they had their saliva collected. Over time, he noticed that his dogs, who began salivation before the meat powder was even presented, whether it was by the presence of the handler or merely by a clicking noise produced by the device that distributed the meat powder. Pavlov paired the meat powder with various stimuli, such as the ringing of a bell. After the meat powder and bell were presented together several times, the bell was used alone. Pavlov's dogs, as predicted, responded by salivating to the sound of the bell without the food. The bell began as a neutral stimulus. By pairing the bell with the stimulus that did produce the salivation response, the bell was able to acquire the ability to trigger the salivation response. Pavlov therefore demonstrated how stimulus-response bonds, which some consider as the basic building blocks of learning, are formed. He dedicated much of the rest of his career to further exploring this finding. So let's start moving into some discussion, okay? How do we all understand now the ideas of behavioral psychology and also social learning theory, now lending itself to classical conditioning? How do you believe Pavlov helped move the conversation of learning behaviors forward through classical conditioning, through his behaviorist approach? How did he move the conversation of learning behaviors forward? Also, does behavioral and social learning still exist in today's classrooms? Does it exist today in the way we approach teaching our students? And more importantly, should it exist in today's classrooms? Right? Is this something that we can reach further into the understanding of teaching in our classrooms beyond classical conditioning, beyond the behavioral approach? Or does this serve its purpose just as well in today's classrooms as it did back then? So, two ideas for discussion once again. How do you believe Pavlov helped move the conversation of learning behaviors forward? And does behavioral and social learning still exist in today's classrooms? And more importantly, should it? So once again, my name is Douglas Jorf. It's been a pleasure doing this assignment. I can't wait to take a look at everybody else's assignment and see what everybody else had to offer. These are some of my works cited that I used in order to get the information for this assignment. And I thank you very much for taking your time and listening. Have a good one, guys. Hello, everyone. My name is Douglas Jorf. I am a Citrus County High School vocational teacher. I will be facilitating a short lesson today on behavioral and social learning as we search by I have